Minecraft has gone through a lot of big changes and updates over the years, but what if we go back 19 major updates and 10 years to a simpler time, to Minecraft release 1.0. Now Minecraft 1.0 came out on November 18th of 2011, meaning that version is almost 11 years old, which is pretty crazy to think. A lot of things have changed between now and then, and a lot of things haven't. So in this video we're just going to sort of play through the game and see what we can experience in this old version of the game, and really answer the question, is this version different from modern Minecraft fundamentally, or have updates just added new features and not really removed the feelings of old ones? Well, for starters, there were villages in this version, although my skin is currently loaded in as Steve. All the functions of the game seem to be the same. It's funny because little subtle differences, like for instance when I'm crouching, the crouch being shorter. Now of course that is much more of a recent change than, let's say, Minecraft 1.0, but just little things like that make the game feel a bit different. It is also interesting to hear the old sound design of the game. I feel like that's honestly one of the biggest differences when you get down to it. A lot of the sounds seem to be just a little bit less refined than they were before. It's also interesting because of course I can't click and drag to make these go across, so I have to split them like this. But we do now have ourselves some bread. It is funny though how much more difficult it is to farm in this version, as basically everything can trample crops. I mean, literally just walking over crops will trample them, which definitely makes it much more difficult than in modern Minecraft. And of course animals could break it at this stage as well. And I mean, there were no carrots or potatoes or beetroot at this point that you could be planting and growing, and so really your options were quite limited in terms of a food source. Now it is pretty crazy to think that this village structure was the exact same all the way up through 1.13, even though it was added so much earlier. Let's see if the blacksmith still has loot. And no, there is not a blacksmith loot chest, so this is definitely not as good of a loot structure as it was later. And of course there was such a limited number of biomes as well. I mean, for instance, here we're in the desert, and there is a taiga biome up there, so there's not really the system of biome borders we have today. But something that has not changed nearly as much is the mining and caving element of the game. And of course, although 1.18 and 1.17 did a lot to change the mining system as a whole, still, a lot of the cave generation is the same between both versions, and more or less all the ores are still there. And so of course the most basic parts of the game, like crafting your first tools, mining your first stone, getting iron and coal, those have really stayed fundamentally the same through the years. Although certainly some things have definitely not stayed the same as well. Like for instance this skeleton down here. These skeletons are actually incredibly easy. I mean, if this was modern Minecraft, I would certainly be dead with those two skeletons there. And the light, there's some coal right there as well, and also some glitched floating water. Funny enough, some of those glitches like that still haven't been fixed, as you can still get terrain generation, where there's water that generates in that should be flowing but isn't. And some things you might not have noticed that slowly changed through the years of Minecraft are some small quality of life changes, like for instance here throwing the coal down. You can see that when it's floating as an item, not only does it not rotate, but it only faces the player, and it's also flat. You can see when you throw it on the ground there, it basically has a paper-thin texture to it, which is of course a lot different to it is now, with a really nice 3D texture that makes it look a bit more real and a little bit less like just a piece of paper on the ground. But I'd also say parts of the game that are now more difficult or easier here, and for instance like this with the creepers, that was incredibly easy to kill that creeper. It really didn't explode very quickly at all, and I didn't have to worry too much. Now for instance this creeper here, I might be able to make that creeper not explode, although I didn't, but things like these skeletons here are just incredibly easy to get. Even on low health with no armor, they don't really pose a threat. But even with that, the game does still feel more difficult. But why is that? I think a lot of it has to do with which stage of the game has been changed in almost every update. And almost always, the stage of the game is the late stages of the game. The very early parts of the game, of course, have been changed somewhat. Like for instance, mobs do not jump around randomly and are super easy to kill like this. And even things like skeletons being really not an issue. And of course with the old PvP system. And yet outside of these things, a lot of things haven't changed almost at all. Like for instance the idea of going into a cave for coal and iron and other materials. What was the first version of Minecraft that you played? Was it Java 1.0 or was it a different one? Feel free to leave your answer in the comments below, as it'll be interesting to see how long people have been playing Minecraft for. Now that we have enough iron to make ourselves this iron armor, we can be a little bit more protected. But I'd say a lot of things are less intuitive in this version of the game, but in sort of both ways. So for instance here, there's no recipes in the crafting table of course, but as well as that, the game is so much simpler, so a lot of things you don't necessarily need a recipe for once you've memorized the basic shape. So for instance a pickaxe like this, or maybe having a shovel just like this. These things basically make sense, and so there's not a massive reason to have a tutorial on how to do certain things like crafting tools. But I think also the skill of the average Minecraft player has risen quite a bit since this era, not just having to do with how difficult the game is, although I would say this version is more difficult. Like for instance in modern Minecraft most players would be having a lot of automatic farms and things like that. But in Minecraft 1.0, although you might have a mob farm, and maybe like a giant sugarcane farm, a lot of things either couldn't be automated, or if they could, the methods to do so weren't really well known, if known at all by the community. For instance, things like farming pigmen for gold, although it did happen and people did do it, it really wasn't something that most players would be doing. Whereas in modern Minecraft that's not really the case, with a lot of players building massive automatic farms later in the game, as overall certain things are made easier, like enchanting. I mean, for instance right here I'll try and kill this Enderman, which may end up killing me, but I don't actually think it will, because the way this system of PvP works, it shouldn't actually be that difficult, although the game is lagging a little bit for me. And we got the Enderman, and even things like this. Right here we have a spider spawner that went right in the ground. Now this definitely cannot happen anymore in the game, these little finds, but there really weren't many generated structures in this era of the game. I mean, there weren't even desert temples. And of course desert temples are in no way a new feature. And so it's interesting to see in something like this, for instance. Let's say the chests that we may find here could be really one of the only loot chests that exist in the entire game. And we have some wheat and some bread and some gunpowder, but a lot of things that aren't necessarily these easy places to get quick loot. And with villagers being useless as well, you wouldn't really have the tools at your disposal to quickly progress through the game, getting to the stage where more or less mining is useless because you have villagers, and manual farming is useless because you have automatic farms. This definitely was a simpler era in the game. I think the visuals though also play a really big role in how the game was perceived at the time. Like for instance, let's say we go to options and I turn the smooth lighting on because I had it off. And although this does make the game look a lot more like modern Minecraft, there's still things like the render distance on the farthest setting being very close, as well as this really large range of fog. So for instance, things that really are nowhere near the edge of the render distance are still going to look somewhat foggy. I think even though this was the release of the game as well, it really did feel unfinished. I mean, things like the villagers here, they're basically just jumping around randomly and hurting themselves on the cactus, with literally no use overall for them. And Minecraft as a game definitely does not feel unfinished anymore. That's probably one of the reasons why modern updates have started to change things about the game instead of just adding to the game. Although of course both are good. I think that that is what's going to start to fundamentally change how we perceive the game. Stuff like the ore mining changes of 1.18, although overall most players were fine with them, they really did change the progression chain of the early game part. I think that's what really made it feel like such a big change compared to other updates, like let's say the Nether update. Although as an example of things being more difficult, of course there's no offhand, you can't put the torches there. And in Bedrock there's some things like that where you can't, for instance, put torches in your offhand. But I think that at this stage in the game, because there was literally nothing you could put in your offhand, it really removed the ability for a lot of convenience things that you could do with that slot. Or there's even items like the shield. I mean, the shield isn't a really complicated item and you probably don't think of it a lot, but just the shield added a massive amount of ease to the game. As for instance, in a scenario like this, it's quite dangerous, but I would have had the materials at this point to craft a shield. I mean, literally just one iron and some planks. And that one item really does add so much ease to the game. As for instance, in this scenario here, I wouldn't have had to worry at all, whereas I could have really died easily because there is no shield. And even the underground fog is a rather strange feature. I mean, right here we can't really see around very well. There's also some sort of strange fog colors, probably because it's maybe the nighttime or becoming the nighttime in the actual surface. But right here we are at this bottom lava level, and I think even though this Minecraft world is a lot simpler than the modern Minecraft world, because of things like the reduced render distance and the fact that most players didn't have a very large knowledge of exactly how the game worked, The game as a whole felt a lot more unknown, and also a lot more mysterious, with things like Herobrine and stuff popping up, because players more or less didn't know what was in the game and what wasn't. It wouldn't be that much of a stretch to think that there might be something creepy in this game with a lot of creepy things, like for instance the Enderman. But let's take a pause on the survival aspect of Minecraft 1.0 and see what we have in the creative mode part. There's actually no way of changing your game mode from survival to creative, just standard. In fact, you can't even open up the chat if you're not on multiplayer in this version. But we can create a new world that's in creative. And I think playing in creative really does show how old this version is, as if we go to the creative menu, you can see that there's very few items that were actually in the game. I mean, so much so the entire creative menu wasn't even full, and it could all fit on one tab. And even though there technically was a dye for all 16 colors, there was literally only one item, which is wool, that could actually be dyed in all 16 colors, which means that if, let's say, you made yourself a whole bunch of orange dye or green dye or really any kind of dye, the only block you could use that dye on was wool. And if you didn't like the look of wool for something, well, you couldn't use colors with it. And it's actually crazy to think how long that was the case in Minecraft. I mean, terracotta somewhat changed that, but it really wasn't until much later that the players had more than just this one type of block to build lots of colorful things out of, with only two types of flowers, one of them being the very nostalgic rose item. You can even see when placing these down lots of interesting differences, like these being spaced apart evenly and always being in the center of the block, and only having two of these flower types, and so unless you want to decorate with maybe some ferns or some saplings, your options really were very limited. And I mean, even the creative mode experience was more difficult. For instance, if I try pressing Control, which doesn't work to sprint in this version anyway, you have to double tap space, I'm not going any faster, I'm just flying at the normal speed. The only thing I could do is if I'm sprinting now, and then I fly up while I'm sprinting, then I could continue to fly at this speed somewhat. But the generation was also really broken in certain parts, like for instance right here. I have literally no idea what this has anything to do with these weird water patterns here and stuff, but the game was riddled with a lot of bugs there. Some of those bugs are actually still in the game today. And another way that made creative mode more difficult is because there were no commands. For instance, you could put this diamond sword in here, and you can't afford the level of XP. Well, there's no bottle of enchanting to give yourself more XP, and there's no command to set your XP, so all you'd really have an option for is to spawn in mobs. Well, you can't even do that, there was no spawn eggs in the creative inventory, so you would literally have to go around and let's say maybe mine some ores to get yourself some XP, and go from there, as creative mode is really just having access to these different items. And some of these textures are also quite nostalgic, things like the diamond block texture. Certainly a lot of things that have changed about Minecraft from this base level have really only been changed somewhat recently. I would say that 1.13 and onwards is what really made Minecraft into modern Minecraft, and even 1.13 only added things, but 1.14 definitely changed them, and 1.16 changed a lot, as well as 1.17 and 1.18. That change in the style of updates will likely make Minecraft feel less and less like Minecraft 1.0 over time, although of course some of the base mechanics will stay the same. What never ceases to amaze me as well is the fact there literally was only one type of wood. I mean, yes, of course there's spruce wood and there's different logs, but in terms of actual wood there was nothing other than just what looks like the oak variety. So if I were to grab these things, not only are they just called wood and there's only 3 types of them here, if I was going to put this into the crafting table, I wouldn't get oak planks, and I wouldn't get birch planks or spruce planks, I would just get wooden planks, and these could be made into the wooden slabs or the wooden stairs. But no matter what these items were made out of, they would have the same texture. And crazy enough, a lot of that didn't change until very recently. For instance, it would be many years after this update that trapdoors of every color would come out, or even things like the sign having more than just one texture of the oak. That was added into the game somewhat recently, and if we head into the Nether we can also see some differences. And something I was thinking about when I was in the Nether the last time in Minecraft 1.0 is the fact that at this stage in the game, if you think about it overall, the Nether and the Overworld almost had the same amount of features as each other. Now of course there were a bunch of different biomes in the Overworld, and that's not the case in the Nether. But if you think about it, the Nether had the magma cube, it has the pigment, it had the blaze, it had the glowstone. It did have a lot of variety in the terrain as well as some unique block types. Although there wasn't any Nether gold ore, there wasn't any magma, and there wasn't even any Nether quartz. There was soul sand and there was also gravel, as well as a nether fortress that was 95% the same as the nether fortress we have now. It's also funny too, because the render distance in the overworld was much smaller in this version, and yet the render distance in the nether was actually larger. For instance, I can see way further here than I could see in Minecraft 1.19, as of course there's a nether fog. Something I also find interesting is the fact that mobs would become hostile towards you if you hit them, even in creative. Let's say I hit one of these pigmen, they would all rush towards me as if I was in survival, which is interesting. They'd even try and get to me the closest path they could. So let's say if I make a staircase for them right here, that works. You can see here they'll still run all the way up to try and follow me wherever I go, and new pigmen will follow me as well. So in that way, there's some very interesting ways in which the survival and creative modes weren't fully separated at this point. And I actually kind of miss this super far away nether render distance. As in modern Minecraft, it's a bit more difficult to see where you're going in the nether. Just like in this version, it's more difficult to see where you're going in the overworld. There's something about the old lava texture, as it was changed way before the texture update, that is something quite nostalgic about this version, as whenever I see that lava texture I know this is the old version of the game. But here is the nether fortress. The nether was of course the place where you got all the brewing ingredients, as it still is, although of course now it does serve a little bit more of a purpose, although not a massive amount more. Going through the creative inventory, and there's no water bottle, there is only an empty glass bottle. So for instance right here, if I'd want to get some water, I'd have to fill up this very old looking cauldron with some bottles here, because I couldn't just do it easily, and there also was no way of just duplicating items in your inventory in creative, and so now I only have one water bottle and I have to manually grab another one. A lot of convenience and ease of access things has really been some of the biggest changes. Let's say the blaze here, it has a different texture, and yet really the function of it is exactly the same, and I think the blaze rod texture might be exactly the same now. But that's enough time in the nether. Let's take one more look at the Minecraft 1.0's overworld. Well, we appeared in an abandoned mine shaft. It's funny, you can see the torch generation isn't quite correct, as of course there's no lighting update around that torch, but now you can see it's working correctly. Now there was a minecart with chest at this stage of the game, and it looks very similar to the current minecart with chest. However, the loot in the abandoned mine shaft would generate in standard chests, and you can see it's a little bit lacking compared to the loot that's often found in abandoned mine shafts now. I feel like the ocean as well is something I'll often look at as a sign of how far Minecraft's come. Now of course the ocean was like this even just in 1.12, and yet this completely empty ocean that really had almost an unchanging base sea level, filled with just dirt and gravel and sand, really does show how the game in a lot of ways was a lot more empty and sort of a lot more barren than it is now, kind of leading the player to have to add the interesting factors to the game themselves. You could fish in Minecraft, but there was no fish mob. There were birch logs, yet no birch planks. There were villagers in the game, yet no villager trades. A creative mode, but no way to get XP. And a soul sand whose only purpose is just to grow nether wart instead of, let's say now, where you can make the soul campfires out of it, the soul items out of it, and even just something like using it to summon in the wither. But they say creativity is best under limits, and maybe that was the potential of Minecraft 1.0 and of course the versions before it. People had just enough resources on their hands to really make whatever they wanted out of this game, and as the updates changed the game more and more, it turned into what we know today. I'd say a lot of the most classic and nostalgic content in the game was made in these versions. As it was so limited, you really had to use your imagination to see what the game was trying to portray with a lot of things. But either way, that was playing Minecraft 1.0. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed it and want to see more content like this, as it definitely is not my normal, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye from me, and goodbye from this very frustrated spider.